Hey everyone, how's it going? So it's been a really long time since I've done a top 10 and I miss them, so we're gonna do one right now. And what better top 10 for someone like me to do? Someone who loves Pokemon challenge runs, and one of the biggest reasons I love them is I get to use a bunch of new moves, new strategies, things I never really would attempt as a kid when I just used Kadabra all the time. Finding out Mimic, for example, was totally broken and useful in Gen 1 has been a really cool revelation. However, these 10 moves are garbage. I mean, there's no better way of putting them. There aren't a lot of moves in Generation 1, and these 10 really are the worst of the worst. And before we get into the list itself, I should go over some basic terminology that we're going to be using. So, moves have a couple stats attached to them. The first is base power, and without getting into the rather complicated damage formula, obviously higher base power is better, but really good moves have about 95 base power like Surf and Flamethrower, while Tackle is 35. So under 35 is worse than Tackle, over 95 is better than Surf. That's kind of a good way to think about it. The other stat is accuracy. This one's easier to conceptualize. 0 means it would never hit, 100 means it theoretically would hit every time. And finally, some moves have additional effects. Usually they're about 33% in Generation 1, but not always. And with that out of the way, I do want to say one more thing about how I determined what goes on this list. Obviously, I could just sort moves by base power and be like, well, these are the weakest, they're the worst. But I was a little more nuanced than that. I looked at whether or not in any solo run, any challenge run ever, these moves would be useful. If the answer was no, then they were a candidate for this list. And I should also mention that I am looking at this from a single player perspective. In multiplayer, well, to be honest, I don't think it would make that big a difference. But without further ado, let's get to my top 10 worst moves of Generation 1. And I'm actually going to start off with a couple honorable mentions. I know a lot of top 10 channels love to put these at the end, but I think it makes more sense to do it at the beginning. So the first move is Splash. The reason Splash didn't make the list is because, well, Splash is kind of supposed to be awful. The whole gimmick is that Magikarp is useless and it becomes a really strong Gyarados. And yes, if we were to include Splash, it would be number 1. It is the only move that is totally useless, with one exception, a move that actively hurts you in many cases, Focus Energy. Focus Energy is simply broken, aside from Pokemon Stadium, which, as you notice, has served as the background for this video because, to be honest, I think it's the first time I've actually shown Pokemon Stadium 1 in a video, so I've wanted to get that out of the way for a long time. Anyway, Focus Energy is supposed to quadruple your critical hit ratio. Instead, it quarters it. It's the result of a programming error. If we were to include it on the list, it would go probably ahead of Splash, because unlike Splash that simply does nothing, it actually actively makes your situation worse. But I thought it would be kinda lazy to put those on the list, so I didn't, but I know if I didn't mention them, people would bring them up. And to be fair, in previous top 10s, I may have not been as thorough as I am now, so fair enough. And at number 10, we have Rock Throw. Now, Rock Throw is 50 base power, and nowadays, it has 90% accuracy, but that was not the case in Generation 1. In Generation 1, it is 65% accurate. I just want you to keep in mind that Thunder, Fire Blast, two of the most powerful moves in the game, only get 70% and 85% respectively. But for whatever reason, Rock Throw, a 50 base power rock move, needs to get 65%. I'm going to be honest, I can't quite fathom why. It's just hilariously low. But for rock Pokemon early on, in some cases, while you might need to reset, it is kinda the best move to use sometimes. So it's not high on the list, but it's on the list. Moving on to number 9, we have a signature move, and signature moves are supposed to be really, really good. Extreme Speed, Volt Tackle, some of the best moves have been introduced as signature moves. Then we get Barrage. And Barrage is literally identical to Fury Attack. And the reason Barrage makes this list and Fury Attack doesn't is Execute really has no need for it. Unless, of course, you were doing an Execute solo run, in which case you're going to have to use this move for an incredibly long time, since Execute only learns one other damaging move, Solar Beam, at level 42. Man, that run is not going to be fun, but it doesn't take away from the fact that while we're forced to use it, it's awful. And speaking of Execute or Psychic Pokemon, I don't know, bad transition, but we're going to talk about Psywave. One of the worst Psychic moves ever, really. Psywave is weird. It can deal between 0 damage and 1.5 times the level of your Pokemon. In other words, at level 30, the most it could deal is 45 HP of damage. It also can't be super effective. Why would you ever use this? And more importantly, why is the 6th gym leader giving out such a useless TM? I mean, Bite is pretty terrible, but it's the first gym, and in some cases it's the only way you can damage a ghost Pokemon, which is why it couldn't make this list. But yeah, I'm just at a loss what Psywave is supposed to do. And worse yet, unlike Rock Throw, which has been buffed, and other moves on the list which have been buffed as well, the only quote-unquote buff Psywave got is it went from an 80% accurate move to 100%. That's right, this awful piece of garbage move only hits 80% of the time. Now listen, I will never support the decision Game Freak made to not include moves in Sword and Shield, but I won't pretend like I shed any tears over Psywave being dropped in the most recent games. But you know how I said some of the moves have been buffed? Well, Counter at number 7 received a huge buff, and unfortunately prior to that, it was kind of a useless move. Nowadays, Counter can actually be game-changing if you use it at the right time, since anytime your opponent uses a physical move, roughly half the attacking moves are physical, if you survive, you deal back to them twice the damage they did to you, so it's kind of like an instant bide, but for only physical moves. Now in Generation 1, that still is the same, it still deals back double the damage that was dealt to you. However, it's not all physical moves. It's only normal and fighting moves. And yes, at the beginning there's a bunch of them, but as the game gets later and later, very few moves are normal or fighting. Heck, even Bruno, the fighting type guy, barely uses fighting moves. And this simply makes Counter far too niche to ever be usable. Sure, if you have a situation where you know the AI only has normal moves to use, it can be helpful, but in all the playthroughs I've done at any point in Pokemon, I have yet to ever find a use for Counter. It kind of reminds me of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where there are these cards that could completely turn a duel around, but only in the most specific of use cases, and thus they were never included in any deck. And Pokemon essentially is a deck building game, and Counter is one of those cards that's just too niche to ever see real use. Moving on to number 6, we have another signature move, and it's just terrible, Kinesis. It's bad sand attack, and the thing is, why not Flash? Kinesis has 80% accuracy, Flash is only 70%, that's even worse. They literally just lower accuracy. Sand attack's 100%. So yeah, I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible move, but at least Flash can be learned by a ton of different Pokemon, many of whom don't have other options for accuracy lowering, which, for the record, I hate, and most of them can just learn Double Team. Flash was close to making this list, don't get me wrong, but I didn't want to put an HM move on there because, while it's not necessary to complete the game, it does make navigation a little better. I don't know. There are use cases where I've used Flash before, but Kinesis being on the Abra line, if you've ever played with Abra, Kadabra, or Alakazam in the single-player game, you know that the whole point of these Pokemon are to go first, hit hard, and never get attacked. At no point is lowering accuracy the right play. You always should be attacking because all the moves you get either confuse or lower special, and like with Barrage, it's an example of a move that's pretty bad, but is made even worse by the fact that the Pokemon that gets it has absolutely no use for it. and so it was a pretty easy move to include. But if you thought those first 5 moves are bad, our top 5 or bottom 5 are even worse. Razor Wind is number 5, and this move is just one of the most pointless and weirdly titled moves, if you want my opinion, of all time. It's a 2-turn move, and I've never really found use for 2-turn moves. The exception being Solar Beam. Razor Wind is less powerful than Takedown, is less accurate than Takedown, and takes 2 turns. But J-Rose, it has an increased critical hit ratio. Nope, that's Gen 2. It doesn't. I don't know what to say. Why does this move exist? Why is it a TM? Why is it normal type when it's called Razor Wind? Shouldn't it be a flying type? At least then it would make sense because there are so few flying moves. It still would be useless, but hey, it could give certain flying Pokemon access to a move better than Wing Attack. But no, we're stuck with just one of the worst TM moves. It's just so awful. And you might think, wow, J-Rose, you really hate this move. How is it not number 1? And that should tell you a lot about the next 4 moves on our list. And the next move is Poison Gas. Contrary to what you would think based on the song, What Kind of Pokemon Are You? You actually don't need much luck at all for Muck and its Poison Gas. One wrong move, and probably you're fine, because this is one of the worst moves in Pokemon history. First off, it's 55% accurate. The exact same accuracy as Sing. And let's compare Sing and Poison Gas. Sing puts a Pokemon to sleep, and even if they wake up, they can't attack the turn they do so. So you've at least immobilized them for 1 turn, up to like a billion turns, let's be honest. And frankly, sleep moves are a really cheap way to defeat very high-level Pokemon. Poison, on the other hand, doesn't work the same way you remember it. As of Gen 2, an eighth of the Pokemon's maximum HP is deducted every turn. In Generation 1, it's a 16th. So that means you essentially get a 50-50 chance to hit another Pokemon, unless it's Poison type, in which case it won't work, with a move that will not allow it to be statused with anything useful, like Sleep, and will take away a whopping 1/16 of its maximum health every turn. What were they thinking? Burn lowers your attack, Paralysis lowers your speed, Sleep and Freeze immobilize you. Poison is a mild annoyance. It's just bizarre, and to have a move, like look at Smog. It's more accurate, and it does damage. Like, it's mind-boggling that this was an actual move they created. It's mind-boggling. Poison Powder is 75%, but no, we gotta have a 55% move that is the most mild of inconveniences. But if you thought Poison Gas was the only terrible 55% accurate status move, let me introduce to you our number 3, Disable. Now, Disable has been buffed dramatically recently, and nowadays Disable with much better accuracy doesn't allow the Pokemon who it is used against to use the last move that they used. So, if the last move they use is Tackle, you disable, it will disable Tackle. Well, let's ruin that. First off, 55% accuracy, so it's worthless. But it gets worse than that. It just disables a random move. Now, yes, against you, this can be pretty annoying, because in the 1 in 4 chance that, well, first off, it's basically a 1 in 12 chance if you think about it, because it first needs to hit, and then if you have one move you really need to use and it disables it, it's very frustrating. But like, you would never use it. Why would you ever use it? Even if a Pokemon had 2 moves, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just attack. And by the way, it's a move I've thought of using in some of my solo runs, because certain Pokemon get Disable as a move pretty early, and I thought, oh, I'll disable Tackle on the Geodude, let it use Defense Curl. It doesn't help. 55% accuracy and even a 1 in 2 chance. So I have a 1 in 4 chance of basically getting what I want. You know what I have a better odds of doing? Hitting Horn Drill. That's right, hitting Horn Drill. For the record, unlike Counter, for example, Disable is still extremely useless, but it's at least not as terribly bad. However, you're all wondering, what could be worse than Disable? And perhaps you'll disagree that this move is even worse, but I think Constrict is the worst move ever created. It's a whopping 10 base power normal move, learned by a bunch of Pokemon that have pretty low attack that might lower speed. You see, Disable, sure, it was a 12.5% chance in these instances, but it could theoretically have a use case. So could Counter. So could Poison Gas. Maybe you use Leech Seed, and there you go. I have just stalled this Pokemon forever. But Constrict is worthless. I mean, 10 base power. 10 base power. That is a third, actually less than a third, of Tackle. I don't think there's more that needs to be said. I guess why Constrict is also so high is the Shuckle run. Yes, it's Gen 2, but I do have to use Constrict because, ironically, it's Shuckle's best move at some points. Which is funny because Wrap, which is supposed to be an incredibly weak move, which is why it deals the extra damage every turn, is 15 base power. But Constrict is 100% accurate. And hey, at least it hits every time. Hooray. But none of these were as bad as what we're going to put at number 1. And those of you who've watched a bunch of my videos, I do want you to take a second and really think there's a move I talk about a lot, especially when the opponent uses it, and I'm extremely happy. And if there's a move I want the opponent to use, probably a terrible move. And that move is Rage. Rage actually is kinda useful in Generation 2. I have done some really cool stuff using Rage strats, but that's because Rage works totally different. In Gen 1, after you use Rage, that is all the Pokemon can do for the rest of the battle. Just awful. It's base 20 power, so it's not very strong, and here's the way it works. The gimmick of Rage is that every time you're hit by an attack, your attack rises once you're using Rage. And I get that they didn't want you to be able to use Rage and then go to Hyper Beam and Sweep. I get it. It would be kind of a cheap way to both deal damage and get kind of a better Meditate. I mean, it actually wouldn't even be that useful, but I get what they were thinking. However, Gen 2 had a really clever solution where you just have a separate Rage counter, and if you don't use Rage, the counter goes back to 0. Pretty simple. Gen 1, they decided to go with even simpler in that you can't select another attack. But it's base 20 power, even plus 6 in attack. You're better off using, like, anything else. Literally anything else. I mentioned with Focus Energy, which didn't make the list because it's a glitch, that it would have beat out Splash as the number 1 worst move because it actively hurts you. Well, Rage, in my opinion, yes, it deals damage, but it also actively hurts you. You never want to use a base 20 normal type attack. There's almost no situation, and oh yeah, there's a glitch where if Rage misses, its accuracy becomes 0.4, which for those of you who know about Generation 1 misses, that is indeed a 1 in 256 chance. Man, it's just so bad. And thankfully, as I wrap up this top 10, many of these moves are better. So at least we can see there was an attempt to take some of these terrible moves and make them less terrible. And perhaps one day I'll do this list in Generation 2. But for now, I thought this would be a fun, quick little video to get back into top 10s. Hope you enjoyed. We'll have another solo run soon, and take care.